Hi, I'm Lauren Rivers, and today I'm going to talk about how I put projects together and my general creative process. The first thing that I'll do when I'm starting to develop a new concept that I want to work on is select a genre. Before I can start putting together the other elements, I have to have at least a basic idea of what I'm working on, whether it be sci-fi or fantasy, because that sort of helps narrow down exactly what I'm looking to do. Now, of course, obviously, with any of these genres, there are a wide variety of approaches and different scenarios that you can look into. Usually, for me, there has to be a very specific spark. I can't exactly describe what it would mean, but for example, as much as I like werewolves, I had no intentions of doing a werewolf project until I read The Lycanthrope Club. And after I had read that book, it kind of just clicked something in my head about a different approach to werewolves that I'd never really seen anybody do. And inspired by that story, I started to put together my own take on the concept. I started assembling the characters and the world, and it just, started to fall into place as I was developing that. But until I had that spark, things didn't really click. And that's kind of how it's been with most of the other projects. I knew when I was separating my characters out into different universes that I wanted to have a couple of specific genres that I wanted to work in. Usually, most of my favorite genres: sci-fi, fantasy, post-apocalyptic, and the fourth one ended up being werewolves. And I've got a couple of other projects right now on the back burner, but right now I think that's enough. Anyway, I generally prefer, when approaching any of my series, something I usually like to term realistic fantasy. Basically, it kind of means that you can have superpowers or magic or whatever the universe calls for, but there have to be rules, there have to be consequences, there have to be limitations. It has to make sense. It can't just be a free-for-all where powers are limitless, or we have, God-moded characters, or magic without source rules, or, characters that just can use magic until the cows come home. And, I like stories where, there are specific guidelines for how things work in this universe. To me, it kind of, I guess basically it just works out to that with rules in place, it's... See, how to put this? Well, I just basically like it that when there are rules, everything just kind of makes sense to me. I like to develop worlds that I can see running. Worlds that would work in a practical setting. So this generally kind of means that there has to be a universe that could function. So, if there's a specific thing like magic or powers, what does this mean? How would this affect the world as a whole? I think about these things. Like, if you have, if you have abilities, is it something everybody knows about? Is it something that there are regulations for? What are the limitations? What are the rules? That kind of stuff. That to me provides better story material than cases like universes where all you have to do is just mutter a spell and it always works. Usually pretty much universally speaking, I always end up having a female protagonist. And I don't know, maybe it has to do with just because I have always played female characters, that I have enjoyed shows that have strong female characters, and like Buffy and a few other things. But for one reason or another, all of my projects have always started with a female protagonist. And whether it's Lauren or Diana or Sierra or Logan or any of the others, I always end up starting with a female protagonist. I tried to do a male protagonist, but I don't know, I always ended up going back to having a female protagonist. The rest of the cast usually tends to be balanced between the genders. I usually like to try and keep it about an even number of each. Not specifically, of course. It all kind of depends on what characters I need. But the protagonist is always female, and so far it seems like it's very hard to get my muse to go in a different direction. Not to say that that's a bad thing, because I like strong female characters, and I tend to think that there really isn't a lot of genre fiction in which you run into female characters that are just strong role models, and that's usually what I like to try and convey. So when I've got my protagonist and my genre, I usually start building up the cast, and this usually entails developing somewhere between 4 to 6 characters, depending on what you're looking for. If you're talking about a universe where the characters are always going to be on the move, you usually want a smaller group. If you have story arcs or different plot threads, which I'll get into some other time, you can have more characters, but usually, at least for the first one, I like to keep it semi-small so that it's intimate and that there's room to expand. So on average, that usually maxes out to about 6 characters. The exception being my main series, Iridescence, which started out with 8, I think, just because I needed that many characters in order to keep everything moving. Typically, whenever I start work on something, I'll map out the entire plot before I get started. This usually manages to help me reduce the editing I need to do later, because I can see the whole story before I even start, and I can sort of work out exactly when the beats need to hit, and I can spot the logic errors. If I run into something that doesn't work, I can think about it before I waste all this time writing out my drafts, and then I can just hopefully repair it when I can just alter a line or two in my notes. It doesn't always work, but usually it does. I'd say most of the time, about 90% of the time, it's helped prevent a lot of unnecessary work. I mean, some people, they do the whole thing where you start writing and just wait and see where it takes you. I can't do that. I mean, I don't have an ending in mind when I start usually, but I have to map out the whole thing. So usually I'll start at the beginning and start working out the plot, and then just kind of let it organically grow as I work out the entire arc. Usually when I'm developing a new major project, I typically seem to plan trilogies, just because I don't like to be working with the characters just for one novel and then I'm done. I usually want room to grow, and as much as I might like to talk about doing longer series, of course the current exception also once again being Iridescence, my main series, it's like I just don't think I have the time right now to conceptualize more than 3. I mean, 3 seems like a good number. It's kind of what the movies do a lot nowadays, and trilogies kind of provide you a lot of places to expand and chances to play with the cast size and move the characters around and explore several different things. I mean, typically, if you check out one of my trilogies, or at least one of the trilogies that I have planned or conceptualized in my head, I try and make each one different from the other 2 in the series, but yet the same. It's not the same story, but it is. I mean, I don't know how to explain it, but it's just the characters evolve, the story grows, new elements come into play, and it's got the same flavor, but you'll never see, for example, a plot repeating itself. The next one is different from the last one, and the one after that is different from the other 2. That's generally how I work. I usually like to have, where can I take this that I have never been before? Typically, when I work out the cast and the story, most things tend to stay the same from start to conceptualization to execution. Every now and then characters or relationships shift, but most of the time things usually follow my plan. Every now and then I'll have to reorder some scenes, or I'll end up with, I guess, what I might call a literary happy accident. But for the most part, things tend to go as I plan, because I spend a lot of time before I get started working everything out. Sometimes when I'm writing things, like I think at least 2 times in recent history, I've had to reorder scenes in order to make the flow work better, just so that the timing works, because even though the plot made sense at the time, when I actually start writing it and working out the time frames of everything, sometimes one of it needs to be slid before or after another, just so that it follows in a logical sequence. And I remember there was at least one instance in which a character's entire arc pretty much changed just because as I was working on a project, I kind of had a thought and a different way I wanted to take it, and it required a little bit of editing to make it work, but it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't clicked to that idea while I was working on it. And it's one of those things that I consider a happy accident because it kind of gave me an avenue to pursue in later projects that will work really well for it. But it never would have been something that I necessarily could have planned. It just kind of really worked out that way. But hopefully, kind of like makeup, you'll never notice it's there, and maybe you won't even be able to tell what I changed so that it worked out that way. But it usually when I'm working on stories, I used to jump around a lot. I would kind of just, I'd have 4 ongoing projects at any given time, and I would let my muse just decide, what do you feel like working on tonight? It was kind of one of my plans to sort of avoid burnout, but I don't know. I mean, maybe my brain just stopped working that way this year, and it really just seemed to not work so well this time around. So, I'm trying something different. I'm working on the same project for several weeks in a row, and I'm actually kind of planning next year to maybe keep that going on a larger scale, to work on several major projects, but only one at a time. And and most of it, you guys won't really notice much of a difference unless you watch the rare occasional stream that I do, which I haven't done a lot lately, mostly just because sometimes I work a lot faster and a lot smoother when I'm just in the zone. I do want to try and do that more regularly, but the key is at least for me to keep consistent production, and that's the priority for the moment. But usually when possible, when I'm working on a new project, I try and get the art of the major characters as quickly as possible. Usually it helps me to form their internal voice so that I know how to write the character, get a sense of who they are, and I found it helps with other people's characters too. It's got to be a specific circumstance. I don't want to say that the quality of art is important, but it kind of is. There has to be just a certain undefinable quality to it that when I look at it, I just can read this character's whole personality. And if the art is sufficiently detailed, sufficiently crafted, I mean, I don't know what the right word is, but if I see a picture of your character and it gives me a good sense of who they are, I can usually write them pretty well without really needing to consult the character creator, and with rare exception, it's almost always spot on. I'd like to think it's a talent of mine. If you have a good enough picture, under just the right circumstances, preferably maybe even showing a little bit of their setting, but it's not necessary. Just as long as it's a good enough picture of the character, it'll click in my head, and I'll be like, oh yeah, I know what this character's gonna say and do. As far as when I work on an individual basis, I usually like to precede the next scene I'm going to work on. I'll after I've finished whatever scene or scenes I'm working on for the night, I'll write a few lines of the next scene to sort of give myself a jumping off point. I used to just finish the scene I was working on and call it done, but I find that if I put a little bit of the next scene, it helps my brain click into the flow of things a lot faster. So, the time varies for how long it takes, but I usually try to be consistent, and putting that little bit of words before the next scene, it usually helps a lot. Most of the time my stories tend to have a predetermined length, at least in terms of the larger projects, and it isn't so much as that they're cookie cutter or anything, but it helps me to have a mental structure for how to build the story. I mean, obviously, if you're writing a novel, you can write as many chapters as you want, you can write as many books as you want, you can do whatever, the sky's the limit. But the way my head works, I always try and conceptualize it, kind of like a 13 episode season of television, and it usually helps me put the beats in the right place. It helps me have the story not be too long, not be too short. It helps me focus on what I absolutely need to get in here, what is important to this story. And it helps me have a roadmap, reduces scenes that are just clutter, because if I know this is how much I have, I will think about what is the most important thing I need to convey with what I have available. And of course, obviously I can always add stuff if I determine I need some more scenes or another chapter or something, but for the most part, because I pre-plan my stories, rarely do I really need to add anything that extreme. Sometimes as I'm working on a scene, I'll determine it needs to be an extra page longer, but for the most part, it's just follow the plan. I mean, writing for me, it has a flow, and typically, I get started. I try to focus on the scene at hand, and just let the conversation go, because a lot of people have said I'm really good at dialogue, and I'd like to think that I have a really good sense of natural conversation, that when two characters are talking, you can hear the conversation that I put between them just like it's natural. There's never, at least in my awareness, any stilted dialogue. Any dialogue just feels like it's somebody writing to wooden character. I don't know. It's just, dialogue has always been one of my strong suits, and it's one of the things that I'm proud of, because I think I do great with dialogue. And as far as my muse, I relate my muse to kind of being like, being tuned to the right radio station. If my muse is working, which I try and keep it happy, but I know that some nights I just know I'm not going to get anything done, which fortunately lately anyway has been relatively rare. But she usually knows when she listens to the right radio station. It's like, oh yeah, this is the flow, and that's why I try and keep to a regular schedule, to keep things fairly consistent, because I know I like routine, and so does my muse. And if everything's in good shape, she if I take care of her, she takes care of me. So I mean, more or less, that's my process. That's how I put together projects, how I do my writing, and I hope you found it informative, and I will catch you later. So thanks for joining me. Lauren out. Thanks for watching, and if you liked it, click the subscribe button and leave a comment below. You can also find me on Twitter and a few other places on the web, or support me via Patreon or Ko-fi. Zebra hugs!